Most of the networking that we're doing doesn't fail because of the people involved or the conversations we have even. It's a failure because of how we tend to set it up. And I realized this 12 years ago in a rather uncomfortable experience because there was a point in Shanghai where I had to acknowledge a particular kind of failure. It was an event I'd created that I was super proud of at the time that had indeed worked, but not quite as well as I thought. And that is a very particular kind of a moment because on the surface, well, everything looks successful, everything feels successful. People attended just as they should. They told me just how much they enjoyed it, how it was indeed a different event, how it was memorable, blah, 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 blah. But underneath their congratulatory words, there was a kind of unspoken question. Did the event actually create the outcome that I'd intended, or did it simply feel pleasant, enjoyable, and different? And those two things, really, they're often confused. But in business, as in life more broadly, they are not all the same. I'd created an event inspired by Salvador Dali, the great Catalan artist. In fact, I've even made a video about that event. First, we attended a Dali exhibition, which was unusual in itself in China. And after that, we had a beautifully designed afternoon tea inspired by Dali, complete with melting clock-style pastries inside a 5-star gaff. Oh, indeed, it was elegant, by Jove. It was certainly unusual. And the few people who attended, those select few, well, they absolutely loved the experience. But after the fact, there were two things that I had to pay really close attention to. The first was this. When people are wandering around an exhibition and they're looking at art, well, they're looking at art. They're not necessarily in a state where they want to talk or connect or open up. And certainly they don't want to discuss any matters concerning wealth management or financial advice. That would make Dali more surreal than he ever intended. No, they were absorbing, they were reflecting, they were moving quietly from piece to piece, taken into this dreamlike state. And the second thing was even more practical. When we sat down for afternoon tea, well, it was like everybody was sitting next to just two people. Now, if those two people were not suitable future clients, or if there wasn't simply a natural connection, then that was it. Game over, and I'd spend the entire event observing wonderful art, eating great food crafted into very unusual shapes, having very pleasant conversations that led absolutely nowhere. And I remember really having to acknowledge this, very frankly, to myself, that I had indeed created something, well, beautiful, but something that was essentially static, something that would not likely lead to any business. That appraisal that I did, really, it was the start of a shift. I realized that the issue certainly wasn't either the quality or even the concept of the event itself. No, it was the structure of the interactions. See, I hadn't designed for movement. I'd designed for something that people enjoyed, but not something that actually worked from a commercial perspective. I hadn't designed for the flexibility that was needed, and without that flexibility, well, the opportunities become totally accidental. So, for my next event, I approached things very differently. Now, I kept the idea of a signature event, something distinctive, unexpected, something exclusive, but this time I designed it much more deliberately. So there was a plethora of wine tastings held almost daily, or more often nightly, in the centre of Shanghai. So I asked myself a slightly different question. What would make this all too familiar event unfamiliar? And after some time, the answer came to me. It was the pairing of wine and chocolate, which is far more difficult than it actually sounds. So we scoured the city, and eventually we found, well, a remarkable venue. It was really very modern. In some places it was dark and mysterious, with fascinating neon lighting cutting through the space. There were these incredible views over what was then the Huangpu River. This is the Mondego. The financial district was lit up in the background, glass towers reflecting light back into the room. And then inside, well, the layout was anything like I'd been used to before. There were these small, intimate corners. There were really unusual chairs. There were strange angles. There were all different levels and spaces, lights all hanging at different heights. And there was an array of colours cast across the space. It wasn't a single boring old room. No, it was a series of special environments all held within one contained space. And that sleek space, along with the unusual wine and chocolate pairing, well, it changed everything. Because now people were on their feet. They were up and around and moving about. They were circulating together in small groups, large groups, in pairs. They were stopping briefly. They were moving again. And that movement, that dynamism, it meant very important things. First, if a conversation wasn't quite working with the person you were chatting to, well, you weren't trapped. You could simply raise your glass, say it was wonderful to meet you, and move on naturally, politely. No harm, no foul. And then in a few moments, you'd find yourself in a completely different interaction with a completely different ambience, and it was all held within the same space. Now that freedom radically changed the entire dynamic of the event. And I remember one moment super clearly. This wonderfully effusive Austrian man by the name of Arno came up to me at some point in the evening. Now, Arno was a highly experienced general manager in a really plush hotel. He was someone who'd seen, let's say, a great deal, who had himself organized any number of wonderful events. And Arno was practically overflowing with enthusiasm. He raised his glass and he said something along the lines of, "Howard, I must congratulate you. I've never been to an event remotely even like this." He didn't even know that venue existed in Shanghai. And Arno had an encyclopedic knowledge of the city. Now, he understood the difficulty of pairing chocolate and wine, and he appreciated the thought and the work that lay behind the seeming effortlessness. And more than that, he felt the effect. And from that time on, without my saying a word, Arno became one of my greatest advocates. He introduced me to others on every possible occasion. He opened doors that others could not. Now, more than a decade later, here in Portugal, I know that didn't happen by accident. It wasn't luck. It happened because of the combination of the environment with the theme and the people who attended. It was a synergistic arrival of commercial opportunity. It was far different from a merely pleasant or memorable event, though of course it was also all of those. What I realized is that our environment, when it's themed in certain ways, well, it shapes certain behaviors. And when that behavior is carried out by the people who match certain criteria that we need for our business, naturally determine and create opportunity. Now, It's the behaviour, so aptly demonstrated by Arno, that really was the missing piece. Now, up until that point, I had thought networking was really simply about getting in front of the right people often enough. Sheer, dogged exposure would surely turn the key and open the door of opportunity. But I was wrong. Talking, explaining, endlessly connecting, handing out business cards, handing out virtual cards, none of this is enough. At least, not primarily. No, it's much more about the conditions which we carry out our behaviour in and the way those conditions are framed. Because when those conditions are right, the right conversations and the right behaviours, well, they pretty much take care of themselves. So now, looking back, well, that shift away from that static event towards the dynamic event was one of the most important changes I made. Now, I couldn't have made that move without the initial failure, and in that sense, the failure was in fact a success, but only because it allowed me the opportunity to analyse and to refine. If I'd simply rinsed and repeated, no discernible progress would ever have occurred. But when I stopped trying to find opportunity inside conversations themselves, picking apart every little moment like a vulture hovering over its prey, despite the fact that I was a rather pleasant and cultivated vulture, and instead I focused on deliberately designing environments where the right conversations between the right people would occur in the right setting, then everything fell into place naturally. And when you do that, online or offline, things begin to feel less forced, less dependent on personal effort and honed attention, and far more aligned with who you actually are. Because the structure, well, it becomes an expression of your unique personality, and the theme is doing much of the work for you.